but they're not quite like those old oil men were.
While in Tulsa, we spoke to Jami Fullerton, whose book Advertising's War on Terrorism recounts an advertising campaign in Arab countries run by the U.S. State Department shortly after the September 11 attacks.
I decided to become a teacher because I enjoyed talking to the kids, working with the children more than anything. My name is Rabia Ismail. I'm a school teacher in public school in the United States of America. I wear a hijab in the classroom where I teach. Children ask me a lot of questions. I have never had any child that thought it was weird or anything like that. And they like the fact, both them and their parents, that they're introduced to a different culture. I was born in Lebanon, in Beirut, Lebanon. I came to the United States in '84. Islam in the United States could be followed just as well as I can follow in my village where I was, raised.
The Shared Values Initiative was a program that the State Department launched right after 9/11. Charlotte Beers, who was a former advertising executive, had been invited to Washington by Colin Powell, and she was sworn in as the Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, I'm thinking late 2002. And she put together this initiative that she called the Shared Values Initiative, and the objective was to basically win hearts and minds in the Middle East and the Arab world. So the initiative was, some might call it a propaganda campaign, but she was an advertising person, and she believed that she could use media, and particularly television ads, to tell folks that, first of all, even though 9/11 happened, we're not at war with Islam. There's a lot of things that we have in common, Americans and Muslims.
In my neighborhood, all the non-Muslims, I see that they care a lot about their children's education just as much as I do, and about family values. My neighbors have always been supportive, truly. I didn't quite see any prejudice anywhere in my neighborhood, after September 11. So I had to work at getting the kids to understand that most important that we should work on our similarities rather than our differences.
There were 3 shared values that she found through her research: faith, family, and education. And so she took those values and built a campaign around them. The core of the campaign were these 90-second mini documentaries, is what the State Department called them. But if you saw them, you would basically say they were commercials. And they were commercials in that they ran on the Pan-Arab satellite and on broadcast television in 5 different Arab countries. And so in that way, our U.S. government paid for this messaging to go out to the Arab and Muslim world. And of course, it sounded like a good idea to Charlotte because she came from the advertising world, and she knew the power of mediated messaging. But it was very much criticized in Washington, and the sense was that it didn't work, and Charlotte resigned, and then we went into the war with Iraq. So how I became interested was there was all this criticism, but nobody seemed to have any research that answered the question, did advertising work in this case? Right after 9/11, of course, 9 days after 9/11, President Bush said to the American people, why do they hate us? And I think everybody was asking that question, why do they hate us? And so there was an awareness on the part of the U.S. government that we needed to do some image restoration, okay? And that's what the State Department does. I mean, this wasn't really new in a lot of ways. This is public diplomacy. And public diplomacy involves winning hearts and minds and telling America's story abroad. And so in the course of that, after 9/11, there was this great urgency to reach out to people in other countries, just the regular people, not government to government, but people to people, and say, hey, we should all be getting along, Well, there were 5 spots that they produced, and they were testimonials about Muslim Americans. So, for example, one was a baker in Toledo who was originally from Libya, and they just followed him in the course of his day, and they showed his family and how he ran his bakery and sold food from his country and all of his American customers. And then it was a shot of the Islamic school where his children attended, and it also showed their family life and their religious life, how they were free to pray and worship in America, and how there were very little prejudice against Muslims in America. It was about a $15 million taxpayer-funded campaign, which really, if you think about international branding campaign, was very little money. And I believe that all the money wasn't even spent because it was cut short. Well, there was a negative reaction in Washington. The best way to put it is, I think one of the congressmen said, you can't sell America like you sell Coca-Cola. Just this idea of using advertising in association with the United States just almost seemed vulgar to many people. But actually, if you look back in the history of public diplomacy, there have been many times that we've used popular culture, mass media, to make a point about America. I think part of it was a culture clash. You bring somebody from Madison Avenue to Foggy Bottom, and there was this automatic culture clash. The media wasn't very kind to her either. They criticized her, and the folks that worked at the State Department really were not well trained in how communication works and how it's measured. And so when folks like Richard Boucher would have to talk to the press, he just wasn't very good at explaining, well, yes, it's working. Well, how do you know? And he wasn't able to interpret that research very well. And so I think there was just a combination of things. And I also think that Charlotte Beers wasn't used to having to answer questions like that. She knew what she was doing and didn't expect, I don't think, all the criticism coming from all sides. They tried to make it much more of a political issue. In other words, it's inappropriate to use advertising. This looks like propaganda. Who is this woman from the advertising world? She has no business here. She doesn't understand the subtleties of politics, and it really was a culture clash. And I'm still not quite sure, because I'm very much an outsider, and I don't always understand why Washington doesn't reach beyond its boundaries and access specialists in areas beyond Washington, D.C. So I'm still learning, and I'm sure there are a lot of good reasons, and if someone were here from the State Department, they could inform me of that. But as an outsider, as a researcher, sort of as an objective observer who is certainly informed about communication, I was a little surprised at how harsh they treated her and the program in general. Well, when you ask me about, how does advertising work in public diplomacy, that's where, I become very unpopular, because most people would say, the two things should have nothing to do with each other. But if you think about advertising and how much we learn from advertising, let's think about, only you can stop forest fires, or click it or ticket. I mean, think about all the public service announcement campaigns that have taught us some very good behavior. And so if you think about advertising in that way, why shouldn't, in very select situations, the U.S. government use paid controlled messaging to get across a message, a favorable message about the United States? The great thing about advertising is that you can control the message. And because it is paid media, you know that it runs. And of course, the downside is you reach a lot of people. It's very efficient. Some of those people don't care. Some of those people are not in your market. But with certain messaging, I think it's very appropriate, in addition to a lot of other things that need to be going on. Yes, I think other countries do use paid media at times, and the world's a bit different, than it was the media world is quite different than it was 10 years ago, and there's other forms of advertising and of publicity that you might consider, including social media now. But this is related to a concept called nation branding, and there are a lot of countries, the United States not so much, but a lot of countries who have very organized advertising campaigns to promote their country. And they use advertising all the time. In one way, think about tourism. To the extent that there's a National Tourism Board, which the U.S. really didn't have until just recently, tourism advertising, in a way, helps people learn about a country. You know, maybe you've never been to Australia, but you sort of know what Australia is about because you've seen ads about Australia or you've seen movies about Australia. So you have to think of it sort of in the bigger picture about how much we learn from the media and how it creates pictures in our mind about places and an image about places. And so in that way, it's all very much connected.
During Book TV's recent visit to Tulsa, we toured the Oklahoma Writers exhibit,